Here's what you need to understand about what unfolded in Davos, Switzerland. Over the last 48 hours, picture the scene. The Swiss Alps, January 21, 2026, snow, security convoys, private jets, and inside the World Economic Forum, the world's most powerful leaders gathered under one roof. In that same hall, less than 24 hours apart, two speeches were delivered that told two completely different stories about global power. One speech projected confidence, strategy, and a vision for what comes next. The other exposed hesitation, pressure, and a quiet attempt to step back from a confrontation that had gone too far. The headlines are talking about deals, frameworks, and claims of success. They're focused on what Donald Trump says he achieved. But that is not what really matters here, because the real story is not about what was announced. It's about what was revealed. Because the real story is not about what was announced. It is about what was revealed. What was revealed, first, on Tuesday, January 20th, when a Canadian Prime Minister stepped onto the Davos stage and spoke with a clarity that many Western leaders have avoided for years. Mark Carney is not a typical politician. Before entering public office, he spent decades at the core of the global financial system. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis. He later became governor of the Bank of England, guiding the world's fifth largest economy through Brexit and global market shocks. He is the only person in history to have led the central banks of two G7 nations. So when Carney speaks about power, stability, and the structure of the world economy, the audience in Davos listens differently. These are not applause lines. These are assessments meant for presidents, finance ministers, military planners, and investors who move trillions of dollars. And what Carney told them was unsettling. He said that the rules-based international order, the system created after World War II, built on American leadership, multilateral institutions, and the promise that law would restrain raw power, is no longer slowly weakening. In his words, it has reached a breaking point. We are not in a transition, he said. We are in a rupture, not reform. Not adjustment. A rupture, a tearing of the structure that held the global system together. For more than 75 years, he explained that for decades, countries like Canada, Germany, France, and Japan had lived inside what he called a useful fiction. The belief that integration automatically meant security, that being tied into global trade, finance, and alliances guaranteed mutual benefit, that the strongest states, even when dominant, would ultimately show restraint. Carney acknowledged that this story had always been imperfect. Powerful nations had long bent rules when it suited them. International law had never been applied equally. Economic pressure had often replaced open coercion. But what was changing now, he argued, was the openness and scale of that pressure. He warned that integration itself could become a source of vulnerability, that dependence on larger powers could be transformed into leverage, that systems built for cooperation could be used for coercion. And then he delivered the sentence that defined his speech. Nations, he said, cannot continue to believe in mutual benefit through integration when that same integration becomes the mechanism of their subordination, when connection becomes control, when partnership turns into pressure, when access becomes a tool of influence. Carney directed this message at what he called the world's middle powers, countries with serious economic and military capacity, but not enough to stand alone against the largest states: Canada, Germany, France, Australia, the European Union as a whole. Their future, he said, would depend on unity, on coordination, on the ability to act together rather than be dealt with one by one. If you are not at the table, he warned, you are on the menu. No country was named. No leader was singled out. But everyone in the room understood the timing. At that very moment, tensions were rising over Greenland, a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark. The President of the United States had publicly questioned its status. He had described it as strategically vital. He had refused to rule out military options. He had threatened economic measures against European allies. He had spoken in the language of ownership rather than partnership. Denmark, a NATO member, Greenland, protected under the alliance's security umbrella. Europe, suddenly confronted with the possibility that pressure was coming not from an adversary, but from its most powerful ally. Carney did not need to mention any of this directly. The audience connected the dots themselves, and less than 24 hours later, on Wednesday, January 21, 2026, the man at the center of that crisis walked onto the same stage. Donald Trump arrived at Davos intending to project strength, control, and success. He came prepared to talk about deals, frameworks, and strategic victories in the Arctic. But the atmosphere had already shifted, because after Carney's speech, after Europe's coordinated responses, after the public statements from Copenhagen, Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, something had become clear. The world was no longer reacting the way it once did. And when Trump began to speak, what the audience saw was not just a negotiation. They saw the first visible sign that a strategy based on pressure, threats, and unilateral demands had run into its limits. They saw, for the first time in this confrontation, the outline of a climbdown. To understand why Donald Trump's appearance at Davos felt so different, you have to look at what had happened in the weeks leading up to it. The crisis did not begin in Switzerland. It began in Washington. In early January 2026, Trump publicly revived an idea he had floated years earlier, that Greenland was essential to American national security and should, in some form, come under U.S. control. This time, however, the language was sharper. He spoke not just about strategic interest, but about necessity. He questioned whether Denmark was capable of defending the territory. He hinted that the United States might need to take responsibility for Greenland's future. Then the rhetoric escalated. In interviews, Trump refused to rule out military options. His administration began discussing the Arctic in terms normally reserved for contested regions, not allied territory. A special envoy was appointed to explore strategic arrangements with Greenland's authorities. Trump Jr. made a high-profile visit, turning what should have been a quiet diplomatic engagement into a media spectacle. And when Denmark pushed back, insisting that Greenland's status was non-negotiable, the pressure increased. Tariffs were threatened, not just against Denmark, but against several European Union states. The message was clear: resistance would have economic consequences. For decades, such pressure might have worked. Smaller allies had often adjusted their positions rather than risk confrontation with Washington. But this time, the response was different. Copenhagen did not retreat, nor did Paris, nor Berlin, nor Brussels. Instead of bilateral negotiations behind closed doors, Europe chose visibility and unity. France and Germany issued statements affirming Denmark's sovereignty. The European Commission declared that Greenland's territorial integrity was a matter of principle. NATO officials emphasized that any threat to an allied territory in the Arctic would fall under collective defense obligations. Then came the military signal. Joint exercises involving Denmark, France, Germany, Norway, and the United Kingdom were announced for the Arctic region. The deployments were framed as defensive, but the message was unmistakable. Greenland was not isolated, and Denmark was not alone. This was the context in which Trump arrived in Davos on January 21, 2026. Publicly, he still spoke the language of strength. He joked with the audience, referred to friends and a few enemies, and projected confidence. But when the topic turned to Greenland, the tone shifted. Instead of repeating his earlier demands for ownership or control, Trump spoke about cooperation instead of ultimatums. He spoke about frameworks instead of certainty. He spoke about complexity. He announced that he and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte had agreed on the outline of a future arrangement concerning Arctic security, missile defense cooperation, and resource development. Because of this understanding, he said, the planned tariffs would be postponed. A framework, not a treaty, not an agreement, a framework. When journalists pressed him on the central question, whether the United States would still seek ownership or sovereign control over Greenland, his answers became cautious. It's complicated, he said. We'll see. There are a lot of factors. This was a striking change. Only weeks earlier, he had spoken in absolute terms. He had insisted that anything short of control was insufficient. He had refused to take military options off the table. Now, standing before the world's media in Davos, he did exactly that. Military action is not on the table, he said. For a leader known for doubling down, for rejecting retreat, for framing every confrontation as a test of dominance, this was a significant shift. Diplomats understood what it meant. The European response had narrowed his options. An invasion would have risked a direct confrontation with NATO allies. Tariffs would have triggered economic retaliation and market instability. Walking away without explanation would have looked like defeat. So a middle path was chosen. By reframing existing discussions on Arctic security and mineral cooperation as a New Deal, Trump created a narrative that allowed him to step back without openly admitting that his earlier position had become unsustainable. But the substance had changed. Ownership was no longer being demanded. Force was no longer being threatened. Pressure had been replaced by language of partnership. And that is why, too many observers in Davos, what they were witnessing was not a triumph, but a recalibration, a moment when a strategy built on unilateral pressure encountered coordinated resistance, a moment when allies demonstrated that unity could limit even the most powerful state, a moment when rhetoric gave way to reality. This was not the story of a deal being won. It was the story of how a confrontation, once framed in terms of dominance, ended in compromise, and how the balance of power, quietly but unmistakably, had begun to shift. What happened next is what truly changed the dynamic of the Greenland crisis for decades. NATO had operated on an unspoken assumption that the United States was the ultimate guarantor of security, and that serious confrontation would never come from within the alliance itself. Disagreements happened, trade disputes flared up, leaders clashed rhetorically, but the idea that a U.S. president might openly threaten the territory of a NATO ally was something most planners had never seriously prepared for. Greenland forced that assumption to be tested. As Trump's statements became more explicit in early January 2026, European governments began to shift from diplomatic language to strategic planning. Denmark, whose sovereignty over Greenland is recognized under international law, made its position unambiguous. The island's future, Copenhagen said, would be decided by Greenlanders themselves, not by external pressure. France and Germany quickly aligned with that position. President Emmanuel Macron stated that European borders were not negotiable. Whether in Eastern Europe or in the Arctic, the German government echoed that view, warning that any attempt to change sovereignty through coercion would have consequences for the entire alliance. Behind the scenes, defense ministries were already moving. NATO's northern members, Denmark, Norway, the United Kingdom, and Canada, began coordinating with France and Germany on joint Arctic readiness. The objective was not to provoke, but to demonstrate unity and preparedness. Military exercises scheduled for later in the year were brought forward. Air patrols over the North Atlantic and the Arctic were increased. Naval deployments were quietly adjusted. The message was subtle but firm. Greenland was not isolated, and Denmark would not face pressure alone. This was a crucial shift. Trump's strategy had relied on bilateral leverage, the assumption that a smaller ally, confronted directly by the United States, would eventually calculate that resistance was too costly. That logic had worked in trade negotiations and diplomatic disputes before, but it depended on one thing: fragmentation, on allies responding individually rather than collectively. In the Greenland case, that fragmentation never happened. The European Union closed ranks. NATO officials spoke in unusually direct terms about collective defense. Canada, whose Prime Minister had just addressed Davos, publicly reaffirmed that Article 5 obligations applied to all allied territory, including the Arctic. Even political movements in Europe that were normally sympathetic to Trump's worldview were cautious. Nationalist parties that often criticized Brussels or Washington still defended the principle that borders could not be altered by pressure from any great power, including the United States. This unity had a practical effect. Every option Trump had previously implied now carried risks he could not ignore. Military action would mean confronting not just Denmark, but the alliance itself. Economic retaliation through tariffs risked a coordinated European response that could destabilize markets and supply chains. Diplomatic isolation would undermine U.S. leadership at a moment when Washington was already facing strategic competition from China and Russia. By the time Trump arrived in Davos on January 21st, These realities were impossible to dismiss. Publicly, he could still speak of strength and success. But privately, the calculus had changed. The cost of escalation had risen sharply, while the likelihood of forcing a concession had fallen. This is why the atmosphere around his speech felt different from the confrontational tone of the previous weeks. Observers in Davos noted that European leaders appeared calm rather than anxious. They were not preparing for a dramatic showdown. They were preparing for something else, a recalibration. The unity displayed over Greenland had demonstrated that even in a world of shifting power, coordination among middle and great powers could still constrain unilateral pressure. That alliances, when they acted as alliances rather than collections of individual states, could still shape outcomes. And it set the stage for what would happen next. When Trump finally addressed the issue from the Davos podium, the question was no longer whether he could maintain maximum pressure. The question was how he would step back from it, and how he would explain that step to the world. When Donald Trump finally took the stage at Davos on January 21, 2026, the tone was noticeably different from the rhetoric that had dominated the previous weeks. This was not the combative Trump of campaign rallies or trade war announcements. This was a president standing before a room filled with allies, rivals, financiers, and heads of state, all acutely aware of the tensions surrounding Greenland and the pressure that had quietly built around his position. He spoke of constructive dialogue, he spoke of mutual respect, and he introduced what he called a framework for cooperation in the Arctic. The language was careful, deliberate. There was no longer talk of acquisition, no suggestion of unilateral moves. Instead, Greenland was now described as a partner, Denmark as an ally, and the Arctic as a region that required shared stewardship. To his supporters, this was presented as strategic success, a deal in progress, proof, he implied, that tough talk had brought everyone to the table. But to the diplomats and analysts in the room, the shift was unmistakable. Only weeks earlier, the conversation had been framed around pressure and leverage. Now it was framed around process and consultation. The threat of confrontation had been replaced by the language of committees, working groups, and long-term negotiations. This was the Climbdown, not announced as a retreat, of course. It never is. Instead, it was wrapped in the familiar language of victory, a narrative of having forced a conversation, of having opened doors, of having reshaped the agenda. Yet the substance told a different story. Greenland's status was reaffirmed as unchanged. Danish sovereignty was acknowledged. Any future economic or security cooperation would proceed through existing international frameworks, not bilateral pressure. In other words, the red lines drawn by Europe and Canada had held. What made the moment even more striking was its contrast with what had been said in that same hall just a day earlier. Mark Carney had spoken of a world entering rupture, of middle powers needing to act collectively to protect their autonomy. Without naming Trump, he had described the very dynamic that was now playing out in real time. And now, here was the most powerful leader in the world adjusting his course in front of that same audience. Not escalating, not doubling down, but recalibrating. The applause was polite, not electric, respectful, not triumphant. The room understood what had happened, even if the official language avoided saying it directly. This was not a deal being celebrated. It was a confrontation being quietly diffused. By the time the World Economic Forum in Davos came to a close, the immediate crisis over Greenland had faded from the headlines. There were no dramatic announcements, no signed documents held up for the cameras, no historic handshakes. And yet, something significant had happened, not on paper, but in perception. The episode had revealed the limits of unilateral pressure, even when it comes from the most powerful office on Earth. It showed that in a world where economic and military power is more dispersed, even a superpower cannot easily impose its will on a united group of allies. When middle powers coordinate, when institutions still function, and when red lines are drawn collectively, the cost of escalation rises sharply. That is why Mark Carney's speech resonated so deeply. He was not simply describing a world in rupture. He was demonstrating how that rupture could be managed, not through nostalgia for an old order, and not through blind faith in a new one, but through deliberate coordination, strategic clarity, and the willingness of states to defend the rules that protect their autonomy. Trump's Greenland Climbdown, framed publicly as a framework and a success, fit into that larger picture. It was not a surrender, but it was an adjustment, a recognition that pressure had met resistance, and that resistance had been organized, credible, and unified. In global politics, such moments rarely come with dramatic declarations. They unfold through shifts in tone, in language, in the boundaries of what leaders are willing to say and what they quietly stop saying. Acquisition becomes cooperation. Threats become consultations. Confrontation becomes process. The stage in Davos had, within 48 hours, hosted to very different messages. One spoke of rupture and the end of comforting illusions. The other revealed, through its careful wording, how those illusions were already being replaced by a more constrained reality. The story of Greenland was never just about an island in the Arctic. It was about power, about alliances, and about the emerging limits of dominance in a world that is no longer willing to accept it. Without question, and this is the part most headlines miss, the real shift was not in what was announced, but in what was no longer demanded.